Thank you so much. So I'm just going to introduce myself very briefly because I know we're all here to talk about Dr. Jenny Wang's book. But just a brief introduction. I am a fourth-year undergraduate student at UC Berkeley, majoring in public health and integrative biology with minors in public policy and Asian American studies. I am a part of AAPIHRG, which is co-sponsoring this event, which stands for the Asian American Pacific Islander Health Research Group. There I've been a student researcher and facilitator for a class, and my research project was on like the impacts of social determinants of health, including like working conditions and wage theft on the health outcomes of restaurant workers in urban Chinatowns. And I am here with the lovely Dr. Jenny T. Wang. And Dr. Jenny Wang is a Taiwanese American clinical psychologist and national speaker on Asian American mental health and racial trauma in Asian American, BIPOC, and immigrant communities. Her work focuses on the intersection of Asian American identity, mental health, and social justice. She's also the founder of the @Asians for Mental Health Instagram community, which I also followed before I even knew about your book. So thanks for that. And in that Instagram community, she discusses the unique experiences of Asian diaspora and immigrant communities. She has also spearheaded the Asian Pacific Islander and South Asian American Therapist Directory and its companion Canadian directory to help Asians seek culturally reverent mental health providers, which is all something is needed. So how we're going to start this event is we're just going to have a little bit of discussion between us, and then we're going to open it up for questions. But I'll just start with a basic question of just how are you feeling today? How are you doing? How have you been in the Bay Area?
Oh, it is beautiful, first of all, and the weather. I'm coming from 95 degrees, 100% humidity in Houston, so this is such a treat. And it's just, I feel like this area is kind of one of those iconic Asian epicenters, and so I just feel so connected while being here.
Awesome, thank you. So your book is really one of the first of its kind as a guidebook on mental health and going on a mental health journey as Asian Americans, and I really felt that when I was reading it. So one of the questions that popped into my brain when I was first reading through the pages was what drove you to write this, and who did you have in mind as readership and an audience for writing such a first of its kind book?
So I would say my first audience was my two kids. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I think there's this thought of, I have gone through these experiences and I've walked with clients through these experiences. And there were these themes that came up again and again. And I think I thought to myself, one day my kids will be where we are, right? Sitting in this room at this kind of age group. And I hope things will have changed significantly for them. But if not, perhaps they could have some of the awareness that I wish I had when I was younger in my 20s and struggling with my racial identity, or wondering where was my place here in the United States and how do I navigate multiple cultures at once. So my kids were kind of the root of what helped ground me, because I was well, they can't say they don't like my book, so at least I'll have their kind of support. But then also the social media kind of space really kind of was a gift to that community as well, because they supported me since the very beginning when I had 40 followers. And, and I think it was also an offering to our community to help us understand that mental health wasn't this extreme thing that media seems to present, but it was a very intimate thing, and that we experience it in all aspects of our lives.
A mental health journey is a really intimate experience, and I can definitely see that throughout your book, you interlace vulnerable personal stories, but also practical exercises that we can use it to apply to our own like, intimate journeys. So like thinking about like the rest stops, there's like reflection activities in this book, and like just like ways that you can like apply it to your own life. Like how do you see like potential readers should like pace themselves throughout the book, and like how like walk us through like how you thought about this structure, because it's like a really cool structure for like personal stories and also activities for readers.
Absolutely. So one of the things, that I really wanted to, I guess, focus on first was just putting language to experiences. Language is one of those ways in which we make sense of our world. And for a lot of us, the psychological language, emotional language may not have been something that we were taught or modeled. And so I think each chapter one starts kind of with a story, because I've been through it, and I wanted to kind of explain that it is there are themes that are so universal for many of us. And then also I wanted it to be really practical and useful. And so then the exercises and rest stops are ways that I hope people will allow themselves to move from just knowing in our minds to actually perhaps shifting frameworks or even doing something differently, and I'm a big proponent of, psychology. So much of it is like a muscle. They're just skills, right? We're just learning skills about emotional regulation, about communication. And so those rest stops are meant for us to kind of practice those skills. And when people say, oh, I got to rest stop and that prompted me to talk to my parent for the first time, or that prompted me to share to a friend, that's kind of the intention of it, is to kind of turn us from the inward into maybe an outward communication and connection. And so my hope is that people won't just speed through the book and read it and kind of register here, but also register on that kind of soul level. So I hope you take your time. I hope you digest and metabolize it. And then I hope you feel something, because I think a lot of us were taught to feel.
Thank you for giving us all that advice, like as we journey like through your wonderful book. And I know you're saying like that it's a lot of like soul work, and that like your goal is for us to feel something. Like just thinking about your chapters, like they all have a common theme of like having an aspect of like permission, and then also like just so many like there's like 10 chapters with different things, such as like permission to question, then permission to feel, to rage, to say no, to take up space, to choose, to fail, to play, to grieve, and then finally to come home. And I think like when I was reading, I definitely resonated with just like the wording, like how like you were saying, we do have permission to choose. And I feel like as like also like a second gen, like I'm a child of immigrants, I just thought that like really resonated with me. So like how did you come up with that structure, and like how did you land on these like 10 different focuses, and also like the idea of like having permission to do that, because I feel like you really gave us to do, like you let us like claim permission throughout this book. So just walk us through that.
Yeah. So I always kind of say that I knew the title of the book before I knew even the chapters or what it would necessarily be about. And I think the first piece of permission, I always felt like my whole life I was seeking permission, right? I was asking my parents, what major should I study in college? What should I do next in my life? Or even society at large. Who am I as an Asian American woman? What does society want me to be? And how do I shape myself to match that? And I think over time, I've kind of moved now to a place where I realize that permission is something that I can offer myself. And claiming permission means that I have more agency, I have a choice, and I don't have to release or kind of dismiss my culture, because that is a part of me that gives me dynamicism, gives me life. And yet at the same time, my culture can be something where I can kind of pick and choose my kind of American identity and my Asian identity, and which parts of those really resonate with who I am authentically. And so permission is really an invitation for all of us to claim permission over those spaces. And then coming home, right? I think every time I go back to Taiwan, they're like, you're too Western, you're too Americanized, right? You don't really belong here. And then at the same time, I come here or I'm here and I don't really belong here either. And so this idea of home feels like so elusive. I don't know if I have a place that I call home. And I think as Asian Americans, we have been kind of searching for a home, maybe for a really long time. And even in the larger society, where do we belong? Where do we feel safe? Where do we feel as though we will be seen as our full selves? And I think I finally came to this place where I realized that it is something we're creating. It is a place that is a state of being. It is a place of connection with people. And perhaps that is where we are.
Thank you. I know you're talking about like how a lot of the inspiration for this book was like about finding home for yourself and doing that identity work for yourself. And you, like we also talked about how you incorporate your own personal stories. And it really does feel like we're going on a journey with you, but also like in our own selves while we read this book. So I want to ask also like how has like your healing journey been for yourself, and like how do you envision like healing for like Asian Americans in general to like come about from like taking advice from your book?
So I would say my healing journey felt like it was in like 15 steps. Like I would get a glimpse of something that would help me through or give me a breakthrough. Like when I decided to pursue psychology instead of accounting, that was like a breakthrough for me. Or when I decided that academics was too toxic for a woman and a person of color like me. And when I finally said, this is not safe, this is not healthy for me, and walking away from that, I think that was yet another breakthrough, and realizing that I didn't have to tolerate or remain in spaces that no longer fit me. And so I think my healing, I almost see healing as this idea of in our lives, we go through pain, we go through suffering, we go through hurt, discrimination, and it breaks off parts of ourselves. And so it's almost like there's a central core, but there's pieces of me that are floating all around me. And sometimes I can touch it, and then sometimes it feels like I can't. And as I've learned to kind of heal and process, I'm reaching into those painful places and then pulling it back into me again and reintegrating those painful parts. And sometimes that's the painful parts of my relationship with my parents. And that's something that I'm still struggling with. And yet now I don't have to ostracize that part. I don't need to be scared of it. I can actually have it be a part of my story and inform how I show up. And so I think when I think of healing, especially as an Asian American, I see it as fullness. I see it as a sense of integration of all the parts that have been fractured away and really reclaiming them again.
Thank you. I definitely really resonate with how like you talk about like your journey with your parents and your relationship with like your mom. I definitely in the chapter of like grief as well. And like there was like another chapter where you opened with the story of your mom, which I like, it was very, very moving. And also how you talk about your dad and how you still like there's still tension in that journey to like have that relationship and continue growing towards that. So like also as a parent, as a mother yourself, like how do you like grapple with that tension between like all these different generations, like you and your parents, and then how do you see like I know your kids are still kind of young, but maybe like when they grow, like how is that going to work with like you as a mother to your kids?
Yeah, I think, you're alluding to those intergenerational effects. And I think on the one hand, right, we hear a lot more now about intergenerational trauma. And on the other hand, I think what we don't hear about as much is intergenerational resilience, intergenerational kind of wholeness and joy. And so I think I'm trying to pass on the joy, right? Being Chinese American and being able to speak to my parents in Mandarin and Taiwanese. I'm trying to teach my kids like Japabwe, right? Different things like that, where I know that it means something viscerally. And so I hope they get to receive all of those pieces. And at the same time, knowing that my parents went through their own struggle and that impacted how they showed up with me, that allows me to be more empathetic and compassionate to those areas where I feel like they couldn't meet me, right? The bridge just wasn't available for them, and they didn't know how to find their way to meet me in the middle. And I think once I can acknowledge that pain, but also that compassion for them, it's allowed me to start building the bridge on my side towards them again. And so I think, my parents, I wouldn't say they were like tiger parents. They were just really scared, honestly. They were scared we wouldn't be successful. They were scared we couldn't provide for ourselves because of how we struggle. And so I think I'm trying to instill in my kids perhaps less fear and more sense of opportunity, of potential. And I think that's something that I have to hold back, right? Like when my kids maybe are, like struggling in school one day, that I don't react out of fear, but I actually approach them and say, okay, let's learn more about the barriers. What's happening here? Let's be curious about it. Because I know, like, for me, I think my parents feared and created shame. It created a sense of, you're not doing this right. Why can't you figure this out? And I think I don't want to kind of pass on that fear to my kids. And I want them to receive abundance in a way that I think my parents couldn't envision.
Thank you for that. I was really curious about that question personally. But I'll just leave with one final question and open it up to the audience, like here with us and Eastwind Bookstore, as well as like online. So just my final question, like I feel like, as again, like what I said in the beginning, your book has really been like one of like the first of its kind as like a guidebook for like Asian Americans. And we talked a little bit about before, like how just like health in general, not even just mental health, but mental health too, like has become so much more like talked about in our communities and like specifically for Asian Americans. And even then you're talking about the disaggregation of data. So I guess like, how do you see like this work, like this health work, this mental health work continue like to go like even deeper into that diversity of what it means to be Asian American, like different ethnic groups, like different generations, like sexual orientation, gender identity, minorities, like how do you see like this work continuing and like, what are like your hopes for like Asian Americans and their health and mental health?
Right, I almost see this in multiple facets, and being a clinician, I think, one, we don't know a ton about Asian Americans in terms of psychological research. The last time that there was a large scale study, I think it was before 2017, perhaps. And so I think that there is lots of ripe opportunity for public health folks, right? And the young adults who are going into the field and saying, well, let's actually start asking specific questions for our communities, right? Let's start asking, questions that really resonate versus kind of using these very generic kind of research models to understand us. And on top of that, we're not a monolith. So one of the things that I'm thinking is, as more and more researchers and clinicians enter the field, can we start to take what we see in clinical practice, right, behind therapy, room doors, and use that to drive some of the data research that we're going towards. So I'm really excited because, I get requests all the time. Can you share my survey, right? Like, and have people kind of respond. And I think that's where we can finally say, perhaps our community needs tailored treatments, needs tailored care. And I think we know that in our minds, but the data isn't there yet to say this is effective for us. So I'm excited for the research, please. I'm really excited for the clinical place because, you know, as I've been doing these events, all these students are like, I'm in social work or I'm, you know, in counseling programs. And I think that's partially why I do what I do, is to show somebody that this is possible as an Asian American and that you're needed, you know. And so my hope is clinically that we start to develop a next generation of clinicians who don't see Asian culture as a deficit, but actually see it as a strength. And that's something that we can really harness to improve our message. But I think representation is half the battle. And so my hope is that clinically we'll have a new generation of clinicians who really bring kind of this next second, third generation of immigrants into that next phase of mental health. And my hope, oh man, I have so many hopes, but my hope is that our community will find more solidarity within our community, but also across communities, right? And I think that if we are trying to move towards more justice, more equality, more belonging for all of us, then how do we start to heal from our racialized pain so that we can hold space for the racialized pain or marginalization of other communities? So that's my hope. And my hope also, and I feel like this is an important part to this book, is that our generation, when we heal, we offer our parents also a chance to heal. And so I hope that happens.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering all my questions. And then I'll definitely open it up if anyone has questions. Do we have questions online? I know we have one question in the back, so feel free to speak out loudly.
Yeah, so should I use the mic or can people hear me? Oh, okay.
I think for the live stream.
I see. Hello, is the mic working? I'm sorry, I'm scared of the camera. So my question was related to the intergenerational parenting dynamics as well. So I'm a first generation immigrant and I want to eventually be a parent, but also raise my children in a different light than my parents raised me. So I wanted to know how that relationship has been in terms of have your parents seen how you raise your children and how they feel about that? And if that's like led to more friction or has it led to more ease in terms of their healing and that whole family structure?
A great question, because I think I'm still just figuring it out. I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. And so, you know, every phase and season is so different. But I think one thing that I'm trying to be intentional with is I'm not raising kids to be obedient and compliant. And that's a really deliberate choice. Because if I raise them to be obedient and compliant, they will not realize that they can stand up against injustice or being mistreated. And so I'm kind of trying to foster a sense of, you can challenge me and it's going to activate all of my internal buttons, but that is okay. And I'm not going to retaliate against you. And I'm going to actually ask you to kind of negotiate with me, right? And I think that is a really different model than how I was raised. And yet my kids are, I don't think, any more ruly than the average kid, but in fact, they can think through problem solving because now they're trying to convince me of the things they want. And they're having to develop those critical thinking skills that I almost feel like I didn't really get until I was much older. And I also think that, you know, especially for my daughter, right, that people will look at her and they will assume that she's certain traits and that she won't speak up for herself. And so being intentional about inviting them to speak and to vocalize and take up space is something that I'm trying very deliberately to do. Now, that's not to say that when they open their mouth, it sometimes can activate me or trigger me too, because I hear those narratives in my head of how I was raised. And it's, ooh, that tone sounds disrespectful. And I'm the parent, they should respect me. And so instinctually, I might feel like they're kind of disrespecting, dishonoring me. This is not the dynamic that I'm used to. And I have to check my ego and say, no, actually, this is not about me winning. That's not the type of relationship I want with them. This is about me walking alongside. And so it is something that I think is a challenge every single day. But I think my parents, interestingly, they are super supportive and also like hands-off, which I know is not the case for all Asian parents. But they really have allowed my partner and I to take the reins in our parenting and to trust that we are doing something that makes sense for our values as a family. And so even when they offer the feedback, it's very open-handed. Like, this is what we've noticed, this is what we've observed, but they don't really impose, you know. And I'll often have clients who say, yeah, I'm trying to raise my kids in a gentle parenting style. And my parents will say, you are so soft, right? And they don't respect you, right? All those narratives. And I think something that our generation needs to do is to realize that we can actually say to our parents, thank you so much for that feedback. I can see how this feels for you. And at the same time, these are the things that we are trying for ourselves. And I appreciate the space to make mistakes and to try new things and to experiment. And, you know, I think that helps me develop those skills. And so sometimes parents buy it, sometimes they don't. But I think modeling even that conversation is really important too.
So we've got some questions from the YouTube live stream from Ella May Salesian. A question for Dr. Wang. How did you adapt your wonderful book, Group Guide, at the end of Permission to Come Home for middle school and high school AAPIHRG affinity groups?
You know, I think people ask me if this book is appropriate for kind of the teenage or, you know, younger adult age. And I really do believe those themes, it's almost like that age group, they feel those things. They might not have language or words to put around it yet, but they understand it almost on a visceral level. And so I think when we talk to young adults about this, I'm always about leading with curiosity. You know, like, what part of the chapter resonated with you? Or, you know, the chapter about my mom's story and kind of the abuse that she went through, like, that may be something that they don't have tangible kind of experience with perhaps, or maybe they do, but what does that stir up in you? And I think that, you know, the questions, I'm thinking through all the different rest stops and questions, I think those still apply in the teenage group. And if anything, I think in the teenage group, their minds are still so malleable and so kind of open. And I hope that this book gets into the hands of teenagers and it helps them kind of challenge some of those frameworks that they thought perhaps were ingrained or had to be the way that they were. So I don't know if I have any adaptations aside from just having trusting and loving adults create space for them and then help guide them through the question.
Thank you. So we have another question from Vivian's friend Audrey. After a lifetime of being accustomed to making ourselves small and invisible, what is it like as an Asian American woman to be publicly embracing our identity and choosing to serve a population who looks like us?
I am extremely humbled to be doing this. And I'm going to get emotional, which I tend to do at these book events, but I think this is not what I thought would come from this. And I am just I feel so fortunate to be able to uplift and amplify the cause of our community, but I don't see this as just me. And I think that gives me so much comfort because there's nothing about me that's any different than anybody here. And I think that piece of us being able to step into this space and own who we are, that gives me the courage to step into these more visible spaces. Because I'll be honest, this makes me uncomfortable, right? To be so visible. And at the same time, I think when I do that, I also give others the permission to do that as well. And so I'm just really grateful. I don't have any other word to describe it. Like I'm just, honored and grateful.
There's another question. This is from Brian Lau from the YouTube live stream. When engaging AAPI families in therapy, how do you help children and their caregivers build empathy and understanding for one another when there's been a history of miscommunication and toxicity?
I think when I think about parent-child interactions, something that I think is at the forefront is this idea of attunement between people. And attunement is just simply this idea where you feel like you and this other person are on the same wavelength. And like even right now, as I'm sitting here with so many of you, I feel attuned. I feel like we're on a similar wavelength. Our energies are matching, our openness, perhaps vulnerability is matching. And when we feel attuned to human beings, because there's a part of our brain that is in charge of this idea of mirroring each other, we feel safe, we feel understood. And so in working with parents and children or adult children and their parents, I have to teach them that oftentimes we're on almost different wavelengths with our parents. Either they're super activated and we shut down in response because we are overwhelmed or we're scared, or we're really activated because we're angry at them and our parents are shut down in response. And so that attunement is how do we get both of them to start to match each other and to recognize what it feels like. Because when you've lived your life in misattunement with people, you may miss those times where those wavelengths cross and meet for just a moment. And then we lose that attunement. And so teaching what it feels like to be in the room with your own parent and to feel that resonance back and forth, that's healing too. Because our body registers healing in a way that the mind and language may not. And especially if we speak different languages between us and our parents, that attunement is something we can train. We can help them look for moments and then to expand those moments into larger blocks of time. So that's kind of something that I think our generation and the clinicians that are working together with families, we can really start to model. Because guess what? In the therapy room, I'm working my best to attune to my clients all the time. And this might be one of the few times in their lives where they feel that attunement for the first time. And so we're teaching that to our clients, and then they go out into the world and they start to recognize it in their bosses and in their partners and in their kids and their parents. And they start to learn how to stay in attunement with people.
Yes, I think we had a question over here.
Can I just ask from here?
Okay, I'm going to just repeat it, I think, for the live stream. Is that good with you?
Yeah, or I can say into the microphone if you want. Yeah.
So Dr. Wang and everyone at the bookstore, thank you so much for putting on this event. So I have a question that goes back to visibility. I, and I'm sure many others in this room and on YouTube, really admire your Instagram for how innovative it is and how bold things you think are. And so I wanted to ask you, what was it like to start that? And were you afraid? How did you navigate that fear of listening and other emotions? And what advice do you have for those of us who also want to speak up more publicly?
100% I was scared. There was no place in time in which I wasn't. And when I started the account, I didn't even disclose my identity initially. I was just kind of like agents for mental health, which is why I didn't put my name on it initially. And I think it was my kind of like small step towards making my thoughts even just more exposed and visible. And I think over time, people would direct message me and say, like, who runs this account? Is this an organization? Is this a person? And eventually I was like, I kind of need to come clean and tell people who I am. But I think it almost was this really gradual process. And I almost think that that is how I could do it in a safe way. I think if I had kind of like, done something that made me kind of viral and then really exposed me in this very large way, I don't think I could have tolerated that, honestly. And I think it would have made me so overwhelmed and scared. I would have kind of gone back into my shell. And so when I think about our community, and I think I did a video about this, it's like this idea of taking up space doesn't mean that you need to stand at the corner with a megaphone, like shouting and screaming, or that you need to, like make these grand gestures about your ideas. It might just simply be communicating these ideas to a loved person, a safe person. And guess what? That's practice for the next step you'll take. And so I'm all about like this idea that everything that I've done in my life up until this point has just been practice for this moment right here. And so what does it look like for our community? One, to hold the fear, recognize that it has likely intergenerational and trauma-based roots in our fears of taking up space and becoming visible, and also do something small and tangible anyway, that we can, on the one hand, carry fear, and on the other hand, carry courage at the same time. And I'm a huge kind of proponent that our goal is not to re-traumatize the community right now by like pushing everybody into hypervisibility. Our goal actually is to help people start to integrate those pieces so that it makes even more sense to ourselves. And then when we start to feel more integrated and whole, that naturally brings a little bit more confidence, a little bit more self-esteem, and then that allows us to inch just a little bit more, and then a little bit more. So I would say take your time, be gentle with yourself. It may feel like it's super urgent, that we do something really big right now, but y'all, this fight is lifelong. This is a long struggle and it is a marathon. So be gentle and do not expect yourself to do something that is just too scary, because that will shut us down. Thank you. Do you have any other more questions? Here.
Hi, Jenny. So earlier you mentioned about going like home to yourself, and you mentioned how, being here in America, you don't feel accepted, and you felt the same thing being in Taiwan too. So I was just curious as to like, how do you cultivate like that self-approval for yourself, like letting go of what people may perceive you to be? And you think that, your own family members, like starting your own family has like helped you cultivate that? Or like, how did you like find your own community to cultivate like that sort of agency and empowerment in yourself?
Yeah, I think I think the cultivation started really gradually. I have lived most of my life knowing how to code switch between spaces, knowing what to say, how to show up, what spaces were safe, what were not. And so I think on the one hand, that outward approval, that's natural. That's human. That's how we stay in connection with people, is to say, well, what do they want from me and how do I meet that need? Or how do I, stay in relationship there? And so on the one hand, it's not a bad thing that we seek approval. The question is, who do we seek it from? That matters. And when they offer feedback, we have to filter that feedback. But I think for most of my life, I just kind of assumed whatever people said about me was true, was valid. I shouldn't question it. That based on how saw into me more authentically than I saw myself. And I think as I started to formulate my identity and the stories that I told myself about who I was and what space I could exhibit or inhabit, that started to help me solidify those values that I live by and the things that I was willing and wanting to release from my identity in order to be able to live in my body and my skin and my soul in the most real way, the most truthful way. And so I think the approval, right? I think that is something that as we start to develop that inner confidence and knowledge that I belong here and that I exist and I have value inherently, right? I have dignity regardless of what I do, that builds a sense of protection from that approval now, where I can say, you know what? I can receive this feedback or this interaction and recognize this is more about you than it is about me. And I can protect myself by saying, I think we're done in this conversation or engagement because it's no longer honoring who I am. And as we start to form those boundaries around what we tolerate, what we're willing to engage in, it also tells us I value myself and I have work here.
Cindy Chen asks, can Dr. Wang speak about at what point in her training/practice she became aware of this AAPI space that needs to be filled/developed, and what did she see as missing?
So I will say that everything I learned about cultural competency and kind of what our community was missing was after my training. And that makes me really sad to say that out loud, but we had one cultural competency class in my entire graduate program, and we did not once discuss Asian American identity. And I know that's really different, perhaps. I trained in Texas, and they were kind of behind in some of that cultural competency that I feel like, California, New York, they're just so much more kind of open and progressive ideas about that. But for me, I literally sat through an entire cultural competency class and never once did somebody acknowledge my race or even acknowledge that Asian Americans were part of marginalized community. And I think back then we were so steeped in this idea of the model minority that how could you have struggled? How could you have suffered as an Asian American? And so that evolution, I think it was entering into my own private practice in Houston, seeing more and more Asian American clients and realizing that for so much of our lives, we had bought into our own invisibility about our race, and we had somehow been taught to comply with this idea that our race was not a factor, our ethnicity was not a factor. And so I think that's when I realized, one, that we were not training clinicians to honor kind of many different identities. We're not just Asian American, right? We have so many other intersectional parts of ourselves. But then two, that there were not necessarily ways where clients could easily find Asian American clinicians. And so the Instagram account started as me DMing as many Asian American therapists as I could in a day to say, hey, let's connect, and will you fill out this Google form because we're trying to build a directory. And I think that is only the first step, though. Like finding the clinicians was the first step, but then how does our entire profession move forward beyond that? Like just because you and I may look similarly or kind of identify as the same ethnic background does not mean that I'm equipped to understand you or to even resonate with you. And so where do we kind of go beyond just a matching of clinician to client, but now how do we teach the clinicians to provide that safety and humility in our work? Because the moment a therapist has their ego as part of the equation, then it's unsafe, right? And so I will tell my clients, please challenge me, please question me. And I will say to them, one day you may become mad at me. And I hope you realize that I want you to be able to say that to me. And I think that that is how we decolonize mental health, because in the Western model, it is expert to client. That power differential is super rigid and strong. And I think we need to shift that balance and actually say the client is the expert of their life, of their story. And I'm, in a way, kind of the humble sojourner in that journey.
Unfortunately, we only have time for one last question from the YouTube live stream. This is from Susie. Susie asks, how do you reply to elders when you bring up the topic of mental health and getting help when they say, we didn't have any counselors to talk to in fill in the blank, any Asian country after the war?
I think it's really neat that the elder would actually say, we just didn't have anybody to talk to. And that's why I couldn't talk about it, because I think that that's actually already an evolved kind of perspective. Because I think a lot of Asian elders would also say like, I mean, we just didn't think about it, right? It wasn't something that like I acknowledged, I allowed myself to acknowledge, or even just to like vocalize some of the trauma or the difficulties they went through. And so I think, you know, one thing I would just be thinking is, I would say, oh, well, it sounds like maybe there's maybe a part of you that wanted to talk to somebody at some point and recognize that maybe that might be helpful. And guess what? We have all these directories that have formed in the last couple of years. Would you consider it now? And would you consider it if that person spoke Mandarin or Vietnamese or Korean? Would that be something that you're open to? And sometimes it's scary, like of that generation to do therapy for the first time. And so sometimes the first taste of it is actually family therapy. So I've had a lot of clients who do their own individual therapy work, and then they kind of tell their parents like, hey, this is really helpful. Would you want to do family therapy together? And then they invite their parents into a space where they can now start to practice and learn some of these skills for themselves. And so I feel like sometimes we don't realize maybe how open that generation might be if we just broach the topic. And of course, there are definitely parents who are not going to and may never go to that space with you. But then I think we can kind of just create conversation. We can ask for stories if they're comfortable and just kind of go there with them and see where that leads us. And at the same time, being mindful of their trauma responses. And if it's too much, also recognizing that and backing off as well.
Let's give a hand to the incredible Jenny Wang and Michelle Wu. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. This was a really inspiring and enriching and delicious event. Thank you all for being here. We have one more event coming up this week with with Rebels Outcry. And we have some more in June, one with Inna Santa Navarro, who is a children's author and a lifelong activist, who will be accompanied by the gamelan, live gamelan Indonesian music. And we also have another one for Uncle Rico's Encore. So please check us out, follow us on Instagram, Facebook. Let's just give another hand to Dr. Jenny Wang and Michelle.